Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about APA style and the major sections of an APA empirical paper. This is a very important skill, and it's something that every single psychology paper that you're going to write in the future, as you move on to quantitative methods, as you move on to research methods, as you move on to your lab class, you're always going to use this style of writing, this way of formatting your papers. And as you move on to maybe perhaps graduate school or maybe whatever comes after graduate school, um, many of the papers that you're going to write have to be in APA style. So it's very important that you understand what's going on here. It's both important and unimportant. Um, how to write a good scientific paper, how to write a paper in general, is something that's extremely important and a very valuable skill to have. But a lot of the minutia that is within MLA style, minutia that's in APA style, um, take it or leave it. I mean, that's my personal opinion. Mind you, I'm going to be grading on a lot of this minutia, but when I write my own papers, many times there are minor mistakes that I make, and I have to refer back to my manual. Okay, so don't sweat it if you don't completely understand what's going on the first time. Another thing that I want to mention is this is a skill. It's not something that I can teach you absolutely everything right here in this lecture, and then you will be perfect at writing a scientific API style paper. Okay. First of all, I mean, look at this manual. It's pretty thick. I'm not going to be able to cover every single minute detail in this. That's why you have the manual. That's why you have access to online versions of the manuals. Okay. You can look at those. You don't necessarily need a lecture to do that. But two, just like riding a bicycle, the first time that you start, you're not going to be good at it. And as if you guys are like any other class that I've ever taught this, your first APA style paper is going to be really bad. And that's fine. Okay. Just like riding a bicycle, learning how to do a pogo stick or hula hoop or whatever skill that we're looking at, things are going to be rough in the beginning, and you should be comfortable with that because you're not going to be able to write a paper perfectly the first time around. Heck, even when I write papers, I'm constantly having to edit myself. There's still a lot that I have to learn. I've been doing this for over a decade now. So don't sweat it if you're not super good. Don't sweat it if your paper is not the best. Learning how to write takes time. It takes practice. And so we're going to try to make sure that you guys get the practice here. So what we're going to do in this lecture, we're going to first talk about the major sections of an empirical APA paper. What I mean here by empirical, okay? Empirical means that we're producing new data. So we're presenting a research study. We're presenting maybe an experiment, maybe a correlational study, maybe it's a new meta-analysis. But we are presenting new data in this paper. It's not a review article. It's not a theoretical article. So we're going to be talking about things from that perspective. And if you can do an empirical paper, the theoretical articles should be a little bit easier because it's just everything minus the data for the most part. All right, and then we're going to talk about specific elements within APA style that are important for you to understand. All right, so specific elements of APA style, writing a scientific paper that you need to be mindful of when you're writing these things. Okay, so let's get started. So sections of an empirical APA paper. So here are some of the major sections here. We've got the title page, the abstract, the four biggest parts of an APA style paper, and the four that we're going to spend the most time looking at are the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. The introduction provides the basis of your experiment. It is the literature review, where you are reviewing papers that have done something similar to what you are doing for your personal experiment or study. It's where you are trying to show the audience, show the reader that there is a gap in knowledge, that your research helps fill that gap in knowledge. Okay, so you start off your introduction very broad about why this kind of research is important. You review the literature, and then you lead the reader, like Hansel and Gretel leaving breadcrumbs, to what research study you were actually conducting and why that's an important study to conduct. So that's your introduction. Then we get to the methods section. In the methods section, the important part is to ensure that the reader could, if they wanted to, replicate your experiment, doing absolutely everything the exact same way that you did. All right, so you talk about what subjects you ended up using. You talk about what materials, what tests, which if you have a brain scanner, what kind of brain scanner you used. Okay, all of that relevant information. And as soon as the subject walks into the experiment, what did the subject do? So again, the important part here is replication, that someone knows exactly what you did, what you controlled for, what you did not control for, and they would be able to replicate your experiment just by reading your method section. So that's a very important section. Results, these are the statistical analyses of our paper. Okay, we present our statistical analyses, and sometimes within we use the statistical jargon in the results section. Then we move to the discussion section. Here, this is kind of like the big conclusion. We talk about our results in English instead of in statistical jargon. Why are the results of our experiment important? Okay, we kind of review what the major results of the experiment or research study were. And then we talk about limitations in our own research. We try to connect our research to all the other studies that have tried to find something similar. And we talk about directions for new research. So we do all of that in the discussion. Finally, we have the reference section, which we want to make sure that we include all the references for any paper that we cited throughout the entirety of our paper. And the tables and figures, once upon a time in APA version 6 and before, the tables and figures would have to be at the end of the experiment. But now, thank goodness, with the 7th version of APA style, you can actually embed the figures and the tables in the results or method section as you see fit. So for instance, if you're talking about the descriptive statistics and the results, why not include the table of the descriptive results right where you're talking about it? That seems to make more sense than including it at the very end of the paper. So that's a very welcome change. I'm not going to be teaching you guys much about tables and figures. I'm going to leave the quantitative methods and research methods class to tell you about the specifics of those. I'm really going to be focused on these 4 major sections. Okay. So what's the general flow of a APA empirical paper? Well, think of it kind of like an hourglass, where we're going to start off very broad, and then we're going to get more and more specific, and then we're going to start getting more and more broad again. So we begin the introduction at why should you care about this research? We start very, very generally, and then we get more and more specific as we're reviewing the literature to our specific question. Okay, then we move on to the method section, where we are the most specific, talking about our own study. Results section, talking about our own results. And then in discussion, we start off very specific, talking about the results of our study, explaining them in easy to understand language. And then we get more general. Okay, what are the practical implications of our research study? What are the take-home points of our research? Okay, those are some pretty important things that we want to make sure that we end with the discussion. Okay, people that are just reading your article in for the most part really care about, this is the hook. Why should you read the paper? Why is this important? And you should leave them with the important take-home message here at the end of the discussion. So think about it as an hourglass type shape when you are writing your APA paper. Okay. With the new version of APA, there are 2 different kinds of papers that are talked about in the manual. There is a student paper and there is a professional paper. All right, so the student paper is used for annotated bibliographies, review papers, response papers, a lot of things that you might have in undergrad psychology. And I think the student papers are stupid. Okay, they are very stupid. Why would we ever teach you how to do something like this that's only going to be relevant while you're an undergrad? This doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I'm going to be teaching you how to do professional papers, because that's what you're going to have to use when you get into research methods, when you get into the laboratory classes. And if you ever want to use this in real world, the student papers are going to be useless for you. So we'll talk about the professional papers. So this is how you would write papers if you were actually trying to publish them. So these include empirical articles, literature review articles, maybe some new theories, theoretical articles, If we were trying to write something to publish in a research journal or maybe a book, this is the kind of paper that we would be trying to write. So we're going to focus specifically on the professional papers. Ignore the student papers. It is dumb. Okay. In case you want some examples of what to do, here are two good websites, two good links that you can actually download some APA style papers that might help you out when writing your own. So I strongly encourage you to look at these resources. Here is the APA's website where they talk about how you should write papers. And here is Purdue OWL, which is a wonderful website to learn all different kinds of writing styles, MLA, Chicago, whatever kind of writing style. OWL Purdue has a good explanation for things. So I strongly encourage you to look at that website if you're having trouble, or just looking at it in general. Okay, so we're going to go through all of the major types or major sections of the paper. So here is our title page. Our title page is on page 1. Let's look at what we have here. At the very top in the header, okay, this is in the header if you're using Word, we have what's called a running head. And on every single page of our paper, there's going to be this running head. Now, the good thing is Word defaults to including this on every single page if you have this here. The running head, if you have a journal, at the very top of the page of the journal is going to be the running head. And it is an abbreviated title that kind of tells somebody that's flipping through the pages what the article is about. Okay, so it's an abbreviated title. It's in all caps. And we also have the page number. Okay, it's easy to do in Word, to put the page number, and then through every single other page that continues, it's going to change. So you can easily tell which number page you're on just by looking at this number. We move down, we see the title of the paper. All right, the title of the paper is bolded. Then we have the authors. All right, the authors of the paper. So we're doing their full academic name as they want to be called. So you can look up how they write their name in their own papers. And that's the name that you're going to write when you do your references. But for your name, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. It could be whatever you want your academic name to be. Okay, but here's the warning. Okay, you're very, very early in your career. You typically want to pick a name and stick with it. The problem is if you pick a name and then change your name and then change your name and then change your name, it's hard for people to find your publications because they might not know about the name change. I had a wonderful professor in graduate school, who published under the name Whiteley at first, or Whitley, I forget, and then Embertson. And it's really hard to find her papers under her original name. So that's just something to be mindful of when you're thinking about these things. Okay. What else? Okay, we have the affiliation. So we see these little superscript numbers, and this tells us where these individuals are located. What is their affiliation? What university are they a part of? All right. So make sure that you include that for yourselves as well. We have an author's note here at the bottom. Typically in the author's note, if your research was funded by a grant, you would include that here in the author's note. Additionally, in the author's note, you include a corresponding address. So if someone's interested in your paper, you have this address that someone can easily shoot someone an email or give them a phone call, send them a letter, if it's really way back in the day, to contact somebody for more information about the study. That's a very important aspect of this research, is to have some way to contact the individuals that did the study so you can find out some more critical information about the research if you wanted to try to replicate it or wanted to try to do some research based off of this paper. Okay. So here are some examples of a title page. Okay, I've already showed you this one. Here's one from me. Okay, here you'll see here that we've got all of these different affiliations. Okay, again, the title is bolded. The fonts can vary a little bit in APA style, so you could use Calibre, you can use Times New Roman, you can use Georgia, which is my personal favorite font, and you can use Arial. But yeah, so that's one of the reasons why we get a little bit of difference here. We have this thank you message to some individuals that helped us provide some of the stimuli for one of the tasks. We also thank some students that helped us with data collection. And again, we have this corresponding email address if someone is interested in the study to go and contact somebody. Okay, so I've already mentioned the running head. The running head should be at a maximum of 50 characters, including letters, punctuation, and spaces between words. So it really is an abbreviated title. You don't want that thing running all the way across the page. That would be not that good. It wouldn't look that good when it ends up going into the journal as well. Also make sure that the running head is in all caps. The next thing that we move to is the abstract. The abstract is a very brief discussion of the study that is kind of your pitch about why somebody should read this study. Typically, when you're trying to find articles, the first thing that you do in determining whether or not you should even read the article is to look at the abstract. The abstract very quickly goes into the major research question that the research tries to answer. What were the major methods? What were the results? What's the take-home point? Boom, boom, boom. Okay. The abstract is between 120 and 250 words. Also notice for the abstract, there is no indentation. I know that seems silly that I'm paying attention to these things, but those things are important here for APA style. Also notice here at the bottom, we have keywords. All right. When people are searching articles, it's nice to include keywords. That way, if someone does a keyword search using something like PsycInfo, they'd be able to find your paper very easily. So you include the keywords there when you are trying to publish a paper. Okay, so the paragraph in the abstract, as I mentioned before, should include a description of the research question, how you conducted the study, the results you obtained, and the practical implications and applications of the research. So the major take-home message. Here's another example of an abstract. This one, of course, comes from me. Notice here that we do not have an indentation here. All right, so the word abstract here is bolded and it's centered. This is known as a level 1 heading. All right, as you go further and want to break down different parts in an APA style paper into further and further subdivisions, you start with the level 1 heading, then you go to level 2 headings, 3, 4, 5. I've never seen a 5, but for a level 1 heading, these are the headings for the major sections. So for instance, the abstract, title, methods, results, discussion, those are all level 1 headings. All right, if you want to have a further subdivision, so let's say in your introduction, you're doing research on cognitive training and improvements in aerobic or cardiovascular health. So you might have one subsection on cognitive training, another subsection on cardiovascular health, and then a third subsection that combines the two of them. So maybe that's how you want to write your introduction. All right, so you might use further levels of headings beyond level 1. Okay. So here are all of the headings. So you start off with level 1. These are centered, bold-faced. Okay. And the text starts immediately afterwards on the next line, but the text is left justified. For level 2 headings, the only change is instead of being centered, it is now to the left. If you have a level 3 heading, the only change from that in level 2 is that it's now in italics. And you can go further down, but I would imagine that that's not something that you're likely to do, at least not for a while. Okay, so just want to include these APA headings if you go into further subdivisions here. Okay, so the introduction is the first major section of an APA format empirical article. This is going to contain the research question, it's going to contain your research hypotheses, and it's going to contain all of the relevant literature. Okay, you're going to do a literature review, and you're going to include that information in the introduction. Typically, you want to do this literature review before you write the introduction. Okay, any papers that help inspire your idea about the research, you want to make sure that you include in the introduction. Okay, you want to make sure that as you're talking about the different papers, you're leading the reader up to the major research question that you're trying to address with your paper. The introduction should begin on page 3, and the title of our paper will be the first part of the introduction, and it's going to be a level 1 heading. So you never say introduction like you say method section or results section. You say the title of the paper. Within the introduction, you are going to have many different citations. For any paper that you talk about, for any idea that you talk about, you want to include a citation. A citation is an abbreviated reference, and we can look at that citation if we wanted to. And if we wanted to find that paper, we can go to the back of your paper to the reference section. And the reference section, that includes a full citation or a full description of the reference. So the comparison here is a citation is abbreviated. You see that in the body of the paper. The reference is the full amount of information, and you see it at the end of the paper. All right. For every citation that you have, for every new paper you cite, you want to make sure that you have that referenced in the reference section. There should never be a paper in the reference section that you don't use and that you don't cite earlier in the paper. There should never be a citation that is not included in the references section. Okay, that is a big thing to be mindful of. All right, it's important to include references and citations for a wide variety of reasons. The first reason, of course, is that you don't want to plagiarize, right? You don't want to say, hey, this is my idea, when in actuality it's not. Okay, so it's very important that you cite things. And also, it's important for the reader to understand how you came up with your research idea. And it might lead the reader to find other cool papers that they're interested in. So it's very critical that you include these citations. Okay, so citation and notation in text that a particular reference was used. So we might say something like, working memory capacity is the ability to hold on to information in the presence of interference. And then at the end of that sentence, in parentheses, we say Engel, 2002, and that might be our citation there. This is a citation for a single author paper. Notice for all of these citations, we use the author's names and we use the year. All right. In fact, if you're in the business, if you're an academic psychologist, many times you just know papers by the names and the year. That's how I do it. Okay. I forget all titles. Titles are useless for me, right? The way that you see these papers referred to is by the authors and the year. So it might be good to get in the habit of, when you're talking about papers, instead of talking about titles, you use the names and the years. Here's some other examples. So if we have two authors here, we're going to use this funky symbol, which is called an ampersand, which means and. All right, and the reason for this is in Latin, and is et, so et. And if you combined an E and a T, apparently it looks like this thing. Okay, I don't really see it, but that's kind of what it is. So this is an ampersand for two authors. You want to make sure that you include that there. If you have 5 or more authors, you use et al. Okay, et al. Et means and in Latin. All here is an abbreviation for alios, which means others. So Harrison and others, the paper in 2013. So make sure that when you have a large number of authors, that you're using the et al. Instead of writing out all of the authors. In fact, if you have 3 or 4 authors or something along those lines, the first time that you do the citation, you can include all the authors, and then the next times that you do the citation, you could just use the first author and et al. Afterwards to do the citation. All right, the references section is at the very end of the paper, and it's going to include every single reference that you used in the paper, and it's going to go from in alphabetical order with the first letter of the first author's last name, and that's how all these articles are sorted. We'll see an example of this here in a little bit. Okay, so we can cite things in 2 different ways. If the authors are important to us, all right, if the authors are important to us, we can talk about the authors, and then after we talk about the authors, we include the year of the paper. So we might say Hamilton Mays, 2006, stated that, and then an indirect statement, talk about what their experiment was about. All right. But most of the time, we just state things, okay, and then we include the citation at the end of the sentence. So if we were talking about prospective memory is defined as remembering to perform a task in the future. I'm just going to include at the end the citation of the paper that I got this definition from. Now, I'm not quoting it word for word, okay? I don't want there to be any direct quotations in your APA style papers. Now, in a real APA style paper, when you're off on your own, you can use direct quotations as much as you want to, but we do it very infrequently in psychology. Very infrequently do we actually quote directly what somebody says. Only when it's something pretty profound or pretty stupid do we quote them word for word. Most of the time we're using indirect quotations. And this is what you guys do. What you guys do is say, okay, well, I need to make this paper as long as possible. I am going to start the quote and then quote the entirety of a paper and then end the quote and say, hey, I completely described what happened in the study. No, that's not what you do. That's not what we do in psychology. So I am banning it. No direct quotations, only indirect quotations. Put these things in your own words. All right. Here's an example of an introduction. So a couple things that I want you to notice. Notice all of the citations in here. Okay. Notice how we're not starting off any sentences talking about these particular authors. Afterwards, after we state something, we then include the citation. Notice that sometimes if we have multiple citations that say the same thing, we can include all of those here at the end of the sentence. So here we have institutions can expect lower response rates when they administer SETs online. So this is found in multiple papers, so we include all of those papers right there. Okay. Another thing that I want to mention is sometimes we are interested in using acronyms. Sometimes we use a word very, very frequently, and so it would be better for us to use the acronym. So the very first time that we want to use the acronym, okay, we write out what we mean. So SETs, Student Evaluations of Teaching. And then immediately afterwards, we give the acronym. And from then on out, we are going to use the acronym. So you'll see later on when they refer to that word, they will call it by SET. Another thing, look, we have a level 1 heading right here. Now the authors want to go into a subcategory. So now they're using level 2 headings when they are breaking things down in the introduction. Here's another example. This one, again, is from me personally. Notice here that I am not really wanting to do as many different headings here in my paper. I think I have some later on, but at least not in the first couple of pages. Also notice that I am creating an acronym very early on, and you'll see throughout the rest of it when I refer to working memory capacity, I use the WMC. Also notice that when I have 2 authors, I'm using the ampersand sign. Okay, I also am going to use it if I have multiple authors. Okay, but if I have a ton of authors, I'm going to use the et al. All right, so that's the introduction section. Now, as I mentioned before, the very first paragraph here is going to be very, very broad. All right, very, very broad in the introduction, talking about the general theme of the research and how it's applied to everyday life. Then we get more and more specific until we get to the last paragraph of the introduction. And that should introduce our research study. It should introduce what our hypotheses are. It should introduce what our research question is. Second major section is the method section. So here, the goal, as I mentioned before, is to provide a detailed account that if somebody were to read our paper, they would know exactly how to replicate our study by looking at the method section. The methods section typically consists of 3 subsections. These are called subjects, or sample, or participant. I like subjects, so that's what I'm going to go with. And then there is a section that goes by many different names. It's either apparatus, or materials, or testing instruments, or tests, or computer programs, or whatever. These are the materials of our study. What are the tests that we gave subjects? If we used a brain scanner, what's the brain scanner that we used? All of the equipment and how we got the equipment is included in this subsection. And lastly is the procedure, and this might be the most important part of the method section. Here, when the subject arrives at the study, we are mapping out exactly what the subject encounters, okay? What goes on in the experiment from the beginning to the end of it, again, so that we could replicate the study if need be. Method is a level 1 heading. Subjects, apparatus, procedure, these are level 2 headings. So subjects. I like the term subjects. I think that it does the best job of describing the people that are involved in research that we study. Some people in the early days of psychology called these people O's, or short for observers, when we used introspection. Afterwards, we used the term subjects. And then in the 1980s, 1990s or so, psychologists thought the term subject was a little bit offensive. It wasn't very nice to say you're the subject, because we call mice and chimpanzees subjects of experiments. So we use the term participant, and participant is still a good way of referring to these individuals. But I hate the term participant. All right, participant doesn't make any sense. One, it's longer than subject, so we're actually wasting space in using the term participants. 2, there's many people that participate in the study. The experimenter participates in the study. The subjects participate in the study. The IRB participates in the study. Okay, the confederate participates in the study. Everybody participates in the study. It's not a very accurate description of what's going on. In fact, we can ask research subjects what term do they prefer, and do they think that one term is offensive over another one, and they don't care. Okay, so subject is the better term. That's the one that I'm going to use, but I try not to use participant, although I've kind of been conditioned throughout the years to use participant. But subjects is by far the better term for this. So now that you've gotten that out of the way, what do we include in our subject section or subsection here in the methods? So we are going to list how we came upon these subjects, how many there are, what sampling plan did we use? Did we use simple random sampling? Did we use snowball sampling? How were these subjects selected? Okay, and then any demographic information that is pretty relevant for the subjects. So how old are these subjects? Are they all in university? How many males versus how many females? If the study might deal with sex differences, or that might be something that might impact the study, we might include that. So any demographic characteristics of our sample of the subjects that we're studying, we include in the subject section. All right, subjects is a level 2 heading, as I mentioned before. The next section is sometimes called apparatus. If you've got some device, if you've got something that shocks subjects, well, you want to include that in a section called apparatus. But many times you don't have some kind of machine, so you might call this materials. So for instance, for us, the best title for this might be materials, because you know there's the passages, the sea otter and the sun. So You might want to, where do we get that from? It's important to list where we ended up finding those. How do we create the multiple choice test? Or it's not multiple choice, but how do we create the test at the end of the study? That's important to include here in the apparatus or materials measures section. Essentially, whatever materials you are using in your study, you want to include them in this section, and you include whatever kind of test materials that you have for your study. Okay. Here we have procedure. This is the third section of the methods. And here we provide a step-by-step account of what the subjects and the researcher did during the research study. And again, we want to list out what the subject first encounters, what they encounter second, all the way through till they're done with the study. All right. The reader should know every confounding variable that we controlled for. All right. Everything that we measured. Every minute detail of the study needs to be included in the procedure section. Again, we want to ensure that if a researcher wants to replicate our study, they would be able to do it. If somebody reviewing our paper wants to point out that we might have a potential confound, we should be able to provide such a good explanation that they would be able to point out any confounds if we have any. All right, you might think that that's something bad and maybe we want to hide those flaws of our study, but that's not science and that's not a good thing. That's not ethical. We want to be as open as possible. If there's problems with our research study, we do not want to hide them. If that's not the way of getting at truth. All right, so after the method section is the results section. This is the third major section of APA style, and this is going to contain all of the statistical information of the study. Typically, we start off with descriptive statistics. Okay, these are statistics like means and standard deviations. Okay, maybe differences between our different conditions, and then we move on to inferential statistics. So statistics in which we are taking a sample and trying to generalize the results of our study to the populations of the people that we sampled from. All right. We will talk more about the results section and what goes in there when we get to the statistics part of this class, but you'll also talk a lot about what's going on here in the results section when you take quantitative methods or if you've had quantitative methods. Lastly, well, not lastly, but the last major section is the discussion. All right, in the discussion, at the very beginning, we are talking about the importance. We're talking about a brief description of our study. Okay, what are the take-home messages? In the results section, we have a bunch of statistical gobbledygook that someone might not understand. Okay, you tell them that the p-value is less than 0.05. Someone might not have any idea what's going on. So the way that I like to talk about it is you are explaining the research to grandma. Okay, grandma doesn't know all of this psychology terms. They don't know all of the statistical gobbledygook, but your grandma is fairly smart. So you need to make sure that somebody, a layperson, understands what's going on with your study. Okay, you need to explain the results to grandma of your study. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to try to connect the results of our study to the larger psychological literature. How do results of our study compare to all of those papers that we reviewed in the introduction of our paper? As we move on, we're going to see if the results of our study have any theoretical implications. Maybe it provides evidence for one theory and disconfirms another theory. All right, maybe we need to propose a new theory. We would do that in the discussion of our paper. We also are going to be very frank about the limitations of our study. What went wrong? Okay, what are some alternative hypotheses, some alternative ideas about why we got the data that we did? Okay, what are some potential confounds that we did not control for? All right, we need to make sure that those are included in our discussion. And lastly, we want to talk about the real-world practical applications of our research. Okay, why did we conduct that research to begin with? Okay, why is our research important? Also, we want to talk about any future directions this research could take. Okay, maybe we might propose a new research study in the discussion, something for another person to conduct if they're interested in it. Okay, what are the next steps in this line of research? Okay, so that's the discussion. After the discussion, there is the reference section. This is where we're going to provide a complete list of all the sources that we've used. Okay, it's important, one, because we want to give the reader all of these studies in case they want to go and look up the studies on their own. Okay, I have found plenty of useful studies by reading other papers and go, ooh, this looks interesting. I really want to see this. So I'll go from one paper and hop to another paper by looking at the references section. All right, and another important thing is we want to give credit where credit is due. Okay, we don't want to plagiarize something. Okay, we don't want to plagiarize other people's papers, so we want to make sure that we give them the credit that they deserve in the references section and citing them in the introduction or wherever we want to cite them. Okay, the references section is ordered. The references are ordered by the last name of the first author. Okay, only include references for things that you've cited throughout your paper. Here's an example of the references section. Notice references is a level 1 header. Okay, the first author here is Avery, A, so that starts, then B, we go down, then we get the D. Okay, so it's in order by the last name of the first author. Also notice that these references are using hanging indentation. Typically for indentation, the first sentence or the first line, there's a space and then we write, okay? But hanging indentation is the exact opposite. The first line, okay, has no additional space, but every subsequent line has that space. To do hanging indentation, you can highlight things within Word, right-click it, go to where it says paragraph and change the indentation to hanging. Okay, that's the easiest way to do it. If you try to do that by just using spaces and stuff, it's going to be a pain in the butt. Okay, so look up how to do that. Okay, so here is an example of our references section. Here is one from my research. You'll notice a couple of differences between this one and this one. One is I'm not including the hyperlink for the DOI. I'll explain what DOI here is in a second. Well, let's jump into what's occurring here. Okay, there's many different ways to cite things. There's one way to cite things. It just depends on what we're citing. Okay, is it a journal article? Is it a paper? Now, you guys are finding journal articles, so pretty much all of your citations, all of your references are going to be in this journal format. Okay, we've got the last name of the first author, comma, his first name, initial, second name, initial, period, comma, then next author until we get to the last author, and we include that ampersand. After that, we put the year in parentheses. Then we have the title of the paper. For the title of the paper, we are only capitalizing the first word. And if there's any word that comes after, like a colon, you capitalize that, but everything else is not capitalized. We have the title that comes next of the journal article, and you put that in italics, comma, the volume number of the work, and in parentheses, the issue number. The volume is italicized, the issue number is not, comma, and then you include the page number. Okay, so make sure that you use hanging indentation. Now, you'll notice that in here, we see the issue number. Okay, the issue number is there for every single citation that's from a research article. Personally, I've never really seen actual psychologists use this issue number. Okay, I don't see it really that frequently. So if you completely remove the issue number, I would not be mad. I don't know why it is APA style to include this, and practically no one ever does. I don't know why that's the case, but that's just how psychologists do things for some reason. The other thing that you'll see at the end is a data object identifier. This is something that was added in APA style version 6. And it is used to have a website and a digital way to identify these papers. If you can find the data object identifier, include it, right? So, for instance here, for many of these papers, they have the data object identifier, so they included it, but sometimes you can't find it. And I'm not a huge fan of the data object identifier. And so if the editors want to include it, I'm like, go ahead, include it, but I'm not going to include it for in my papers. For you guys, if you have the data object identifier, include it at the end of the citation. If you don't have it, no sweat. I'm not going to count off points for it. Okay. So here is another example of a research article that you might try to cite. Sometimes you might have to cite books. Sometimes you might have to cite a chapter in a book. This is how you would go about doing those things. Sometimes you have to cite a TV show or a website or a movie. There's lots of things that you might cite in a paper, but I can't give you all of the different ways to cite those things because that would be very boring and a huge waste of our time. The APA manual is your friend here. It shows you how to cite these things. But for you guys with this one paper, you're only going to be citing research articles. You shouldn't be citing anything else. So just to give you that heads up. Okay. So moving now, let's talk about elements of APA style. Okay. What should you be focused on when you are doing these papers? Well, when I was an undergraduate student and I took a course in research methods, it was kind of like a hodgepodge. It was research methods and statistics combined. So imagine if quantitative methods and research methods were combined into one lovely 6-hour course. Imagine how fun that would be. So that's what I took. And I had a lovely, lovely professor, very inspirational for me, Charles Brewer. And Brewer always mentioned when you're writing, there's 3 things that you should be caring about. And this is clarity, conciseness, and felicity of expression. And it is true. These are things that you want to care about when you're writing a scientific paper. And these are things that if you have learned, for instance, in English 1101, how you might have written papers in high school, there are some things that you might have picked up on that are not the best practices in a scientific paper. All right, first one let's talk about is clarity. You want to write in a way that the audience completely understands what's going on. You want to write in such a way, again, that if someone wants to try to replicate your paper, they're easily able to do this. So do you use figurative language? Okay, and say, like, the subject was hungry as a horse. No, okay, that's wonderful in poetry. That's wonderful in many papers where, you know, it might elicit like different things for different people, okay? But really bad for science, okay? If it means something different to different people, why the heck would you include it? You want everybody to be on the same page in a scientific paper. Another thing, you've been taught to vary your words, okay? If you use the term outgoing here, you want to use the term extroverted in the next sentence, okay? Now, again, in an English paper, you might want to use variations to keep things, you know, spiced up. You know, the reader doesn't get bored. You don't do that in a scientific paper, okay? If you are referring to something and you give it a specific name, you use that name every single time. Because if you use the term outgoing here and extroverted over there, I don't know if you're meaning the exact same thing. Okay, so don't do that. That's going to confuse the reader. So we want to be as clear as possible. So we might be sacrificing some of this flowery language. We might be sacrificing word variety by repeating the same words, but this is clearer and this is what we want to do. Okay, we don't want to muddy what it is that we're talking about so people are confused. We're using as straight and forward language as possible. 2, and this is the one that you guys have the hardest time with, and I mean, I kind of understand it. So conciseness, okay? You want to be concise. Okay, the goal of a psychology paper is to be as short as possible, and that blows your minds every single time. You guys will ask me at least 100 times, how long does this paper need to be? And I want to rip out my hair every single time that I hear that, okay? Ultimately, the answer to that question in any class in psychology is the paper needs to be as long as the paper needs to be. Now, that doesn't help you very much, okay? But it's the truth, okay? In psychology, we don't want to be overly wordy, Okay, we want to say what we need to say in as few words as possible. We want to say it as quickly as possible. These journals cost a lot of money to print. If you can go from an 100-page article to a 75-page article, you are saving a vast amount of money. So a lot of times we have page limits instead of, no, your paper needs to be above 10 pages. No, your paper needs to be smaller. It needs to be shorter. You need to cut things out of your paper. I find myself, when I'm actually writing, having to cut things out as opposed to add things. And that is weird for you guys, and I understand that. All right. So again, you want to cover everything. You don't want to leave something out. But if you can say it in a quicker way, you say it in the quicker way. Now, the habit that you guys are in, and I don't know if you picked it up from English or if you picked it up from high school or where you picked it up, is to fluff out things as much as possible. In your mind, what the professor does is they take a ruler and they measure how long your paper is, and they grade according to how long that paper is. And that is not what happens. If you're saying the same dang thing for about 2 pages, that is useless. Okay, that's not good writing. Okay, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking to make sure that you're covering everything. So a paper that is 10 pages long can be better and get a better grade than a paper that's 20 pages long. It's just a matter of what you're covering. So I know that that might not help you in, okay, well, what do I need to write? How much do I need to write? Okay, but again, it's not how much you write. It's about what you cover. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense for you guys. Okay, felicity of expression, and I got to tell you, when Brewer first mentioned felicity expression, I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But as I've gotten older and hopefully wiser, I understand what Brewer is trying to say. Your paper needs to still be pleasing to the reader. Some of you will read these psychology articles and hate them and think, why do I need to read this thing that's so technical? But I got to tell you, some of the most fun things that I have ever read were psychology articles. If the person knows how to write, the researcher knows how to write an article, it can be a masterpiece. So you're still trying to write an article that is fun, that is pleasing for the audience, okay? And in fact, if the article is more pleasing to read, it's probably going to get read more frequently and cited more frequently than if your article is awful, okay? I review articles quite frequently, and let's say that I'm reviewing an article where English is not the author's first language, and their study might be amazing. They might have done a great job, but if they cannot convey that in the paper, it's not a good article, okay? And it's bad, and I realize the limitation. If you made me write in a language that I don't have that I'm not as familiar with, it would be really, really bad. It would be worse than these guys' articles. But the article needs to be understandable, okay? The reader needs to understand what's going on. There's no excuse for a psychology article not being somewhat pleasant to read, okay? When you are in graduate school, before you do your dissertation, you have to do prelims. And prelims takes many forms. For me, it was like this really, really long test. So I had to study for 6 months with probably about 300 different journal articles, like 5 different books that I had to read in this period of time. And then you take a test on all that information. So here is one of the papers that I had to read for prelims, and I thought someone was pranking me. All right. This article starts off with, suppose memory is a vector with X number of items. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about, okay? Your paper should be able to be read, I mean, mind you, by other psychologists, so not necessarily a lay audience for everything, but it should be somewhat enjoyable to read. So, felicity of expression. All right. I'm going to cover some of the highlights here of what's going on, but ultimately you are responsible for the minutia. Okay, like I said, this is like riding a bicycle. You're going to have to do things many times before you completely understand what's going on. But let me talk about some of the highlights here. One what voice should you use? Should you use the active voice or the passive voice? So should you say the researcher conducted the study or the study was conducted by the researcher? Now, in English, the passive voice is clunky. The passive voice is harder to understand. So you want to use the active voice as much as possible, where you say, we did this, or I did this. Okay, Tony did this. You don't say, this was done by Tony. All right, it's clunky, it's hard to understand, the reader's not going to enjoy it as much. So rely on the active voice, get rid of the passive voice as much as you can. Acronyms. Acronyms are great, but you don't want your paper looking like alphabet soup. If it's a word or if it's a phrase that you use very, very frequently, then use an acronym for it. But you shouldn't get to the discussion of your paper and then it looks like just letters. Okay. Now, people have limits to their working memory capacity. They have limits to their short-term memory, and you're really taxing their limits if you have 12 different acronyms. So keep it simple. Only use a few acronyms. And the first time you use an acronym, as I mentioned here, you might say working memory capacity. You write it out the first time and then include the acronym here in parentheses and then use the acronym later on in the paper. You never start a sentence with the acronym. You have to find a way to not start a sentence with that acronym. All right, this is a pet peeve of mine. For words like since, while, and when, okay, people use these incorrectly all the time. So people will use the term since instead of meaning because. They'll use while instead of although, and they'll use when to define things. So classical conditioning is when food powder is presented with a bell or something like that. That's when refers to time, while refers to time, since refers to time. Don't use these incorrectly. So you do not say, I brought a keg to the party since my parents just wrote me a check to buy books. Okay, since is a time. It doesn't mean because. This is incorrect. While smacking a bear with a tennis racket may look fun, you will have a bad time if you do it. Ooh, I love some of these examples that I came up with. Again, not the correct use of while. Dabbing is when you put your head in your armpit and you put your arms to one side. Again, don't use when defining things. Okay, these refer specifically to time. Last thing here, make sure that everything is double spaced, that you use 1-inch margins on all sides of the paper. There are multiple fonts that you can now use. It used to be the case that you could only use Times New Roman. So you can use 11-point Georgia, Arial, and Calibri. My pet peeve, I hate Calibri. I don't know why Word defaults to that. I think it's stopped defaulting to that, but Calibri is awful. Georgia's where it's at. Arial's good. Times New Roman's good, but I love Georgia. For words that refer to numbers, if let's say you say two, there were two subjects, you write out two instead of using just the numeral. And very, very important, everything in your paper is past tense. Okay, so the researcher conducted the experiment, not the researcher conducts the experiment. So make sure that you're using the past tense when you're writing things up. So again, this is not a complete understanding of what's going on with APA style. You will have to do it yourself. And I've designed this class so that you'll be writing things and struggling with them, and then you turn it to me and I give you feedback on them. Okay, that's the only way that you're going to improve. Okay, it's not like I can explain absolutely everything of how to write things up and then you know how to do it perfectly. You're going to have to get in the water sometime and try to swim. So good luck with that. And I will talk about more of the specifics actually in class. All right. Well, I hope that was helpful, and I will talk with you guys later.